All right, so I was just talking about the Umayyad dynasty, and actually, I needed to back up a little bit. Some of the features of this dynasty is that they tended to be Arab-centric. In other words, they favored Arabs, and there was this. It appears that they saw Islam to almost be a kind of Arab thing at the expense of other ethnicities, and they didn't take this view of it being a universal religion. And they may have had their own, kind of greedy ambitions in this, in the sense that, it's not clear. Remember that if you're Jewish or you're a Christian, you can stay in your religion, but you have to pay a special tax, and that tax gets removed if you convert to Islam. If you're encouraging everybody to convert to Islam, then you're going to lose some tax revenue, right? And so there's things like that. And so if you notice in the textbook, it was mentioning that this caliphate was definitely starting to fall apart at a certain point. It was losing its legitimacy. And ultimately, there was another competitor from the Sunni branch of the Quraysh tribe that basically a branch that were descended from the Prophet's uncles. And the Abbasid clan advocated the overthrow of the Umayyads and reconciliation between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and they were going to be much more favorable to non-Arabs as well. And so what's interesting then is you get, sorry, I'm just going to move over here, the creation of the Abbasid dynasty. And it's going to last a little bit longer. The Shiites are going to support this, really thinking that this is going to be a good thing for them, and it ends up being another Sunni regime at the expense of the Shiites, okay? And so here's something else I want you to understand. We look at the modern conflict in Iraq. When Saddam Hussein was in power, I remember many commentators saying the Shiites have been suppressed by Saddam, for decades of suppression by Saddam's pro-Sunni regime. And I thought, well, for the most part, I think there's one dynasty called the Buyids, which is like maybe a century out of all this time, the Shiites actually have the political power, even though they're going to be the majority a lot of times. And it's going to be the Ottoman Empire that's going to end up ruling them. That's a Sunni empire. And so the Shiites are going to be a very long, politically suppressed branch of Islam that's actually rooted, its history is rooted in southern Iraq. Okay, and they're going to go into other places. The majority of Shiites, the largest Shiite country is actually Iran. Okay, but those are not Arabs. Now, why I'm bringing this up is I just kind of want to address as I go into the ancient history and talk about now. When George Bush led the invasion to go into Iraq and then set up democracy, you can imagine the Shiites who had been suppressed for all this time just explode and unleash unprecedented political power. And what's happened in Iraq is literally, again, unprecedented Shiite power. Now, prior to this, many Shiites and Sunnis were mixed. Saddam Hussein was Sunni, but his right-hand man was Roman Catholic. It wasn't a clear-cut Sunni bias towards against Shiites. But what's happened now, most certainly, is that Shiites have a taste of political power they're not going to give up, and it's been at the expense of the Sunnis. And the Sunnis who felt betrayed by the United States, the Saudi Arabian government now is highly anti-Shiite. And so what's happened is that Iran has now been favored in a better position because of Shiite power in Iraq. This is at the expense of Saudi Arabia, and this whole thing has spilled over, and the backbone of the support for ISIS and ISIL is all of these Sunnis that felt like that they got basically shoved into the gutter, into the streets, as a result of the U.S. invasion and the facilitation to the rise of Shiite power. Okay, do you understand that? So I felt like I needed to kind of put that in there to kind of then bring us back and to kind of see how the past and the present kind of emerge. Okay, so when the Abbasids take power, like the Umayyads, they are, in a sense, secular as much as religious. And they're going to take on some of the administrative aspects of the regimes before them. So the Abbasid dynasty is going to take a lot of influence from the Persian courts that they're actually taking over. And they're going to favor the Nestorian Christians there. So the Assyrians now, who are being so persecuted now in Iraq, at this time are going to be in a favored position. And by the way, I didn't mention this, many Jews and many of these Christians who are being persecuted by Orthodox Christianity are going to help facilitate Muslim conquests also. And so in the initial phases, the Nestorian Christians were probably treated better by the Abbasid Muslims than they were by the Orthodox Christian ruling and so forth. Now, this is in the Persian part, okay, should I say. But I should refer back also to the Jacobites or these other groups. In other words, the condition of Jews and Christians here initially is probably not going to be considered worse than what they were facing before, whether they were living under a Zoroastrian court or especially an Orthodox Christian court. And if they were a minority, it was bad, right? So there was also, at this time, just say there was the paper revolution, an increase in literacy, and trade and travel were flourishing in the sciences. And actually, the Christian Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who is also a Nestorian Christian, some say he was an Assyrian Christian, he was the head of the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. So the relationship, again, between Jews and Christians is not always inherently bad. That's my whole point that I've made before. I'm not saying it's inherently good either, but not inherently bad. And the Umayyads, which are going to flee and go into Spain, many Jews and Christians are going to be a part of their courts as well. Okay, so I just want to say that. We're going to have to move on. I'm going over so much. I needed to quickly talk about the development of Sharia law. Islamic law is not just the Quran. Okay, let me clarify. It's a blending of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad and his actions. Okay, and there were thousands of things floating around. So yes, the Quran was formulated very quickly, but these sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad don't get canonized by the Sunnis or the Shiites until relatively, actually a lot later. So Bukhari and Muslim, that's their names, are considered sahih, authentic canons, the most authentic out of all the different thousands of traditions of the sayings of the Prophet and the actions. And often these are used in conjunction with the text. So again, I said the Quran doesn't say pray 5 times a day explicitly. We find it in the Hadiths. Some argue that it's implicitly in there, but the Hadith gives you explicit things. So the actions of wars, how you relationships between men and women, all of these come, a lot of these in details in the Hadith. The Quran is very powerful imagery and poetry, like expressions that are not always easy to follow. Hadiths, whether you agree or disagree with your, they're very clear and straightforward, is my whole point, okay? Then you had 4 schools that come out of the Sunni tradition, and you don't need to know all these. I just want you to know that there were these different schools of thought. There were legal schools that combined these hadiths with the Quran. They looked at things and they made legal decisions on things. I mean, so for instance, what do you do, not to be crude, but masturbation is not expressed in the Quran. It's not really explicitly addressed in the hadith, so then where does it get placed in? And Christians go through the same thing as well, something like that. So there's certain things that are explicitly mentioned in the Quran, and other things are not, and so they're all creating these like systems of law as they take political power. Shiites do the same thing, and they have their own collections. Some of them are similar to Sunnis, and some are different. One thing that I just want to say is that Shiites and Sunnis initially are relatively the same as Muslims, except that they have a little variance of an opinion, obviously, about who has the right to rule. But over time, the Shiites are going to take on certain ideas that are really alien to the Sunnis. One, the cutting of themselves, that festival is something that's really shocking to a lot of Sunnis. Some of their hadiths, they have their imams that they say are basically perfect and could do no wrong, and that they elevate them in a level that for Sunnis is blasphemous. They have a lot of these pictures that I was showing you that the Sunnis don't do. They have pleasure marriage, mut'ah, which is talked about a lot, where you can have temporary marriage to a woman. And if the baby's born, it's legitimate, but at a certain end of time, you guys are no longer married. It just kind of dissolves, and it's considered legitimate. There's just different things that are going to occur that are really make them stand out. We could say Protestants and Catholics, but it's not the best comparison. But if you wanted to visualize the differences, that's the kind of way to think about it. Protestant and Catholics can look very different, and on one hand they can also become very much the same. And I would argue that many have gotten along in the past, but currently, especially since the war in Iraq, Shiite and Sunni tensions are at an all-time low on a global level, and very unfortunate, and something to keep in mind that has been escalated really due to current politics, although reaching back into time.